Let our talk be the feast. Let's think about British food through the ages and try to find out why British food has got the reputation which it has today. British food, what do you think of when you think of British food? Bland, stodgy, a little boring, fish and chips, crunchy, oily, not very healthy. These are all things which people might say about British food. So why is English food so meh? Of course, we might like it, but at the same time, the excitement of French or Italian or Japanese cookery is not something that we would feel when we are facing a month of fish and chips. So let's go back in time and see where this originated. First stop is Roman Britain. Here's a Roman feast. You can see they're raising their glasses and carousing around the table. Now, Britain was colonized by the Romans since the 1st century before Christ. That's about 2,000 years ago. If we look at the Roman table, we can see foods which we associate with world cuisine nowadays. Let's take a closer look and think about how these impacted the diet of the early English people, British people who were living under Roman rule. Which of the following foods do you think have been part of the diet of British people since Roman times? Please go through and decide by yourself, what do you think people ate? Did people have bread in Roman times? Did they have carrots? Did they have chocolate? And so on. Pause the video if you want. Okay. So what did the Romans eat? Potatoes? No. Bread? Yes. Eggs? Yes. Carrots? Yeah, the Romans had carrots, but actually they were very rare in Britain until the British got carrots from the Dutch, the Netherlands, in the 16th century. So basically Roman Britain didn't really have much carrot in their diet. Pasta? No, not until the 19th century in Britain, and not really commonly until 1936. Even the Italians didn't have pasta until the 10th or 12th century. Snails, yeah. Go out in your garden, pick up a snail, boil it, yum. Chocolate, no, not for years. Chocolate came from trade with Africa, so that wasn't going to be till the 15th century. And grapes, yeah, grapes could be grown in Britain, but probably were mostly imported. So there were quite a lot of things that the Roman diet went without, but they did have very nice spices, and they had quite a good way of cooking. Here's a Roman villa. You can see how the farming was well organized and mixed, and they've got their cows there, cows and sheep. They've got stuff coming in. They've probably got honey somewhere in the bees' apiary. And so the pattern would stay the same for food production for quite a long time. And the mix of sweet and savory, the use of wine, the use of spices, from Roman through medieval and even Renaissance cookery, we could see a continuity of a tradition. We could see some common ground between European cooking and cooking in Britain. Okay, the weather in Britain was not quite so good as the weather in Italy, so maybe the grapes were not going to be quite so juicy, but the kind of main idea, the strategies, the composition of sweet and salty, the use of meat, but not too much meat, was also a feature which we could say British cookery shared with European cookery at that time. Here's a painting of Marcus Gavius Apicius. He was the first cookery writer, and his book was published in the 4th century AD. That's about 1,600 and something years ago. It was called De Reina Coquinaria, and it was quite a comprehensive recipe book with sections about cooking meat, sections about cooking vegetables, sections about health, sections about dessert, and so on, sections about fish. So it was a comprehensive guide to food and cooking, and it also included some recipes, which we can take a look at today. Here are some of the ingredients which a modern chef used when they went to try and cook a meal from Apicius. We can see caraway seeds and ginger. We can see some kind of berries there and some herbs, maybe coriander. And I think this is a bean. It's a Turkish pack, so it might be chickpeas and olive oil, maybe honey or butter. And so these were common ingredients of Roman food. We can see that they had a mixture, sweet and savory food, and also rice. You can see the writing style of the Apicius manuscript here. So can you read those letters? Brevis Piementorum quo in domo esse debent. So it's like a short guide to what spices you should keep in your kitchen. Uten dementis nibi desit, nihil desit. So I'm talking about them being useful. And the basic things that you need in your kitchen. It's quite a long list, isn't it? Here we've got the list, which I picked up. Some things you might know the taste of from the grocery store if you go to your local grocer. Saffron, the yellow spice, which you find in the Spanish dish, Spanish pilau dish with fish and rice. And pepper, myrrh, which was used for pickling bodies. It's a fragrant spice, and actually we don't use it in cooking nowadays. We might use it in perfume, but it's not a common edible ingredient now, but it was a medicine in those days. It was also a spice. Cardamom you can get in your local Indian grocer. Indian spice is actually not named. So the Romans had a spice mix, which they called Indian spice, but they're also using some other spices we think of as Indian spice. Coriander, cumin, and sesame, mint, nuts, other things which they use as basic things to give a flavor. So we can see that Roman cookery was quite tasty. They were using a lot of spices, and that's not the same as what we imagine our fish and chips or our normal English cooking nowadays, is it? Something's changed. So what changed? Here's a Roman meal. We can see they've got some bread, fruit, some kind of leaf which has meat inside, a big meat stew, lots of beans. It looks like it would be quite a pleasant meal for us today as well. Oh, I was going to get you to guess what the different things were. So I'm going to give you a look at a Roman recipe. And this is fascinating because it tells us about the Romans' idea about health. Here is honey refresher for travelers, so called because it gives endurance and strength to pedestrians. As a person who enjoys walking, I'm interested in this recipe, with which travelers are refreshed by the wayside. And this is made in this manner. This is translated from Latin. And you can find Apicius on the internet if you look at Project Gutenberg. Flavor honey with ground pepper and skim. that is rather strange. So we've got this sweet, and then we're putting spice into it, probably boiling it, and then taking off any scum which is on the top. At the moment of serving, put honey in a cup, as much as is desired to obtain the right degree of sweetness, and mix spiced wine not more than a needed quantity. So we've got our honey and pepper mix, and then we're adding wine, which already has some kind of spice. It sounds rather strange. Add some more wine to facilitate its flow in the mixing. Yeah, now it's beginning to sound rather good. Romans had many places to eat, and I wanted to show you this because I was really surprised that the Romans had a place like a fast food joint. If you go to Rome nowadays, you can still see the counter where they would have done this kind of counter dining. And the food, you can see meat, beans, actually you can't see meat, but bread, eggs, some kind of vegetable, maybe grapes, beans, nuts, and wine, which were things people would go out to the taberna and eat. So that's just to say, in a way, Roman life is not, it seems like not that far in some ways away from what we experience today. And so we can see Britain as part of Europe in that sort of way, the same cultural tradition across Britain and Europe. Here's a list of the things which Roman Britons could have eaten, things which were introduced, kind of fruit like cherries and plums, which were introduced to Britain by the Romans. Some of the spices and herbs like mint and seafood, and the things that were found when they dug in an archaeological site called Silchester, included peas, beans, grapes, apples, olives imported from the south, figs and wine imported from the south. So these things were actually found in the remains of an ancient town when they dug the remains. Some interesting health advice from Apicius about keeping regular. Regular means being able to go to the toilet regularly. So Apicius, like many modern Japanese also, believe that food is a medicine. And I love this because it has a funny title for me, a harmless salad. In fact, it's been translated as harmless, but what it means is if you take this salad, then eating a lot of vegetables will be okay. You won't have runny stomach, upset stomach after eating a lot of vegetables. So what does he put in? Ginger, rue is a kind of herb, dates. You can buy dates in Cosmos nowadays, and they're imported from a very hot, dry climate. A teaspoon of pepper, 40 grams of honey, and Ethiopian or Syrian cumin. So you're going to mix the ginger, the dates, the pepper, the honey, and the cumin in vinegar. Now, vinegar is su in Japanese, so that's a very sour taste. It's going to be a kind of sweet and sour salad dressing. Take a spoonful after the meal, and this is going to stop the salad from giving you wind or stomach trouble. So I thought that was a quite amusing, healthy recipe. Then we've got a kind of normal recipe for chicken cooked with herbs and milk. And I think some of Apicius' recipes really sound quite tasty. I think I've had a friend who cooked an Apicius chicken recipe for me a few years ago, and it was actually very nice. A bit like cream stew. So we're going forward in time now to the medieval feast, and the thing you might notice here is very showy food. There's lots of food, people are eating together, and we've got food that looks like animals. For example, this swan, it's a roasted swan. So the medieval people like to show off. They were very status conscious and entertainment conscious, and the food was used for showing off a little bit. Here's another example of a feast with lots of roasted meat, big gold dishes, and people giving a snack to their dog underneath and drinking lots of wine. These are actually from France. So again, we can see the medieval French feast, the medieval British feast were not that dissimilar. So Britain has still not fallen behind in the food race to be delicious at this point. They're still eating lots of meat. And here we've got some kind of big joint with pepper on the top, or olives and pepper. And here's one more showing off medieval feast with a peacock. The records, the writers of this time emphasize how exotic people like to make their dishes. And in social history, it's interesting that the way of eating was also special and different. In this time in history, we're about 1,000 years ago, 800 to 1,000 years ago, not everybody had enough money to have a plate. A plate, a knife, a fork were actually knives and forks were still far in the future. We were eating with our hands, maybe a spoon, and instead of a plate, we used bread. So the bread was the plate. And if you were not too fancy, not too well-mannered, you could eat the bread as well. If your table was nice and clean, then after you finished eating the soup or the meat dish which was served on the bread, you could eat the bread as well. Some people might be too polite and just leave the bread behind or leave it for their servants to eat too. So here you've got a meat stew and they've served it on bread. In medieval times, that could have gone directly on the table. If you were a lord, like we saw in the previous picture, you might have some gold plates, you might have some beautiful pottery plates, but the normal people would not have been using those beautiful dishes every day. And the diet was very meaty. Here we have some evidence from the Tower of London. You might know the Tower of London as an attraction in London. In 1485, in the King's spending money roll, there is a record about the way that money was allowed for the beef eaters. The beef eaters were the guard at the Tower of London. You can see the beef eaters in their beautiful red uniform on one side here, and you can see the amount of meat which was allowed for the 30 beef eaters per day in 1485. And it seems to be about 48 kilos of meat for 30 people. That's about 1.6 kilograms of meat for one man in one day. Nowadays, doctors recommend about 1.6 kilograms of meat for 1 week. So they were eating a lot of meat, perhaps as a status symbol, perhaps because they thought it would make them strong. They were also drinking a lot of beer, about a gallon of beer. Now that was partly because the water might have been dangerous. So fermented drink like beer has been through the process that means it's safe to keep. And so there was a health reason that even children would drink beer, not only the adults. And so we're going forward to modern times, and on the way we're seeing something which is common in modern times and ancient times. It's using pastry as a container. In medieval times, farmers or miners, as you can see on the other picture, would eat, and then if their hands were dirty, they could hold the pastry using the crust as a handle and then eat some of the pastry, throw away the part that got dirty from their hand. But actually, some people point out, here are some miners eating a pasty in the 1950s, and pasty means a meat pie. Meat pies are very common from medieval times right up to now, both for the rich and for the poor. And it's a kind of convenience food because you can eat it outdoors using the pastry as a wrapper, as a wrap instead of a wrap before paper. So, of course, not everybody could have such luxurious food. Here's somebody with their medieval meal, a bit of soup, a bit of bread, a bit of cheese, a bit of fruit. And that looks quite like what we would eat for a, not too rich person's meal nowadays too, doesn't it? So we still might have some herbs, some vegetables in our stew. So what changed? The English Civil War. In the 17th century, the king was perceived to be too selfish and to be asking too much money, too much agreement from the people around. And also the King Charles I was not trusted by some of the people who wanted Britain to keep on the Protestant path. It was partly about religion. You can see that in their clothes. Here we've got the Roundheads wearing a round. They also wore round hat style, but in this case he's wearing a round helmet because our Roundhead here is going off to war against the king. The Cavaliers wore very elaborate and kind of rich style clothes and big hats, which was a way of saying we're actually, in a way, we're actually superior and we're not going to war. We don't agree with the war. The English Civil War was very complex, but the result was that the king lost. And as you may know, the king was executed, King Charles, in 1649. And after that, Christmas was forbidden. The Puritans wanted to go back to the very simple essence of Christianity. So they wanted to be like the early Christians. They wanted to understand everything, and they didn't want to have a lot of showing off, a lot of expensive food, expensive clothes, and they went to the extent of making a law to forbid feasting on Christmas. This only lasted about 1 year because people didn't really obey it. So they had the law passed in Parliament, everyone said, yeah, and then it's thought that they didn't really change how they celebrated all that much. But it was still a feeling of disapproving of enjoying your food. And so part of my theory is that people started to feel food wasn't something, or your physical pleasure wasn't something that you should enjoy. And by the 18th century, the English had a reputation for eating lots of meat. So we're going towards modern times where we eat a lot of meat, and we don't really care how it tastes because it's not really moral to enjoy our food too much. Here are some rulers of England. What can you see that they have in common? It looks like they enjoy their food, but in a sense, they're eating a lot of meat, and possibly a little bit too much. So under these people, we've got Henry VIII, we've got George IV, I think, and he was also known as a great eater of meat. And then we've got Queen Victoria, who presided over the expansion of the British Empire, and she also seems to have expanded her waist quite a lot. So how did English food get to be the worst in Europe? We've looked at the Puritans. Now we're going to look at Mrs. Beeton's cookery and household management. This lovely young woman here, some people think is responsible for the decline of British cooking. And finally, we've also got the Second World War and the rationing of food, which may also contribute to less joy in our diet. Here's Mrs. Beeton. This was a book which I loved as a child. My grandmother had this book, and I love to read it. It's a really, really big book. It's got 1,000 pages, and it tells you about everything. It tells you about cooking, how to take care of your house, how to have a party, how to arrange your table, what to do if you're sick. So when I had to stay home from school because I was sick as a child, I used to like to look up some recipes, and I would ask any adult who was around to make something out of Mrs. Beeton, which was going to make me healthy. So it's got a very kind of fix-it tone in her book. You can see the date, 1861. So Mrs. Beeton's book of household management was very popular. It sold 60,000 copies in 1 year, and it became the most popular book, only second to the Bible. Here's a picture of the table. And one thing you can learn about Mrs. Beeton's book of household management was the look of the thing became very important. She was writing for new, young, middle class or upwardly mobile housewives, and so they had a lot of emphasis on the look of the thing, the decoration of the table, the look of the food. Here's Mrs. Beeton's quotation. "Dining is the privilege of civilization. The nation which knows how to dine has learned the leading lesson of progress." So she's writing in the middle of the British Empire. She's very confident, and she's teaching the wives of the empire to be proud and to arrange their table. Why was Mrs. Beeton so popular? She was a great writer. She was funny. She seemed to know everything. She was like the big sister who you just wanted by your side in the kitchen. She wrote about the management of the house and staff, not only about cooking. She was quite easy to understand. Her recipes were step by step, do this, do this, do this. And she seemed to have quite glamorous, quite fun food, and she was making us think about how to have a glamorous and fun party as well. She wrote not only about cooking. In conversation, this is two more quotations which you might like. "Trifling occurrences such as small disappointments, petty annoyances, and other everyday incidents should never be mentioned to your friends." So don't tell your friends about your troubles. And the final one is about cheese, and it's just to show you her style. "It is well known that some persons like cheese in a state of decay and even alive. There is no accounting for tastes." In a way, this is a kind of poke at French, because French cheese is often quite smelly, and actually it's kind of becoming a bit moldy. But of course, it's really delicious, complex taste. But Mrs. Beeton was not having any of that kind of thing. So this was a time of rising middle class. People wanted to know how to behave. Mrs. Beeton tells us how to impress. If you take a look at this food, it's a jelly made with carrots, peas, meat, and savory jelly. Food was becoming more complicated. The purpose of the food was kind of to be clean and impressive and show off our skills. and also to be economical, but to look good. And so in a way, it's not real food. It's the beginning of a trend towards food that is not real food, or it's food that is very separated, very processed, separated from the origin of the food. A final quote: there should be a place for everything and everything in its place. This is one of the most popular quotes. It's talking about being well organized. And actually, if you know the movie Mary Poppins, this is something which Mary Poppins quotes from Mrs. Beeton. The look and appearance were the most important. Actually, she makes fake food. She makes something like, let's make a cheap version of apricot jam. Apricots are a delicious yellow fruit, a bit like a plum, ume jam, which you make with ume, should be made with fruit. Mrs. Beeton tries making apricot jam with carrots and sugar and almonds. So it looks like apricots, tastes of sugar. It's not real apricot jam. Another example was turtle soup. A turtle is an animal with a shell. And of course, it would be very bad to make turtle soup nowadays because they are an endangered animal. But she's making turtle soup with calves' feet. Don't tell anybody, it'll taste almost like turtle. It's actually made with the feet of a cow. Another example, how she tries to make the food which looks like something different from what it is. It looks cute and it's too complicated. There's a really nice YouTube video of people trying to make this anchovy butter, tomato butter on asparagus sandwiches with savory jelly. So they've got bread, then the butter, which is made of mixed fish and tomatoes and butter, and then asparagus, it's a vegetable, and then there's a jelly over it, and then it's decorated with rosettes of the butter again. It's kind of dreadful. It tastes awful. We've got some more quotes from lovely Mrs. Beeton. And one of the things which is really interesting here is, just focus on this one. The kitchen should be remote from the principal apartments of the house so that the visitors shall not perceive the odor of the cooking or hear the noise of the cooking. In other words, we want to be separate. The dining room should be separate from the kitchen, because if we're burning something or it smells bad or the cook is freaking out, the cook is getting upset and screaming, then we want the kitchen to be far away so that the guests will never know about that. And this seems to me to kind of encapsulate how unreal her cuisine is kind of all about, showing off and about unreality. She also recommends cooking for food for too long. So people who try her recipes today, she'll say boil your vegetables for 20 minutes. Nowadays, we boil them for 8 minutes. She also took recipes from other cookbooks, plagiarism, without testing the recipe completely. So probably one of the tendencies in British cooking, which has been really bad, is to boil stuff for too long and use too much water and then throw away the water. And it's taken most of the 20th century to learn to keep our vegetables crunchy. That's only been fashionable since the 1990s. We've got a bit more about dear old Isabella here. One of the sad things was she died when she was very young. She also lost her father when she was very young. So she was educated outside the home. She was clearly very smart, and her husband was a publisher. So what happened was her book went viral because her husband was a great publisher. She was a great storyteller and writer. But she actually died before she'd really experienced all the cooking which she was writing about. So she's a delightful, interesting person, but she was not as great at cooking as we would think if we think about her influence. So somebody says this: she helped people to overcome the loneliness of being a young person responsible for the household. And so this is a kind of tribute to her. But at the same time, we probably were too much influenced by Mrs. Beeton. And then rationing happened. So food was restricted in Britain from 1940 to 1954. So my mum, as she grew up, hadn't known banana or oranges or chocolate as a regular thing. She would get very, very small amount of chocolate for a special treat. And then she'd have to cut it up into thin slices. And even butter and eggs and sugar were rare in this quite long period. We're going forward in time rather fast now to my childhood in the 1970s. TV chef Fanny Craddock and Major Craddock, seen here working on their Christmas turkey over a glass of wine. Many things about how to enjoy food, which we still are influenced by in Britain nowadays, I think emerged from Fanny Craddock's show. Her show was a kind of entertainment, but she also stated in her show, Escoffier, the French chef who wrote a lot about cooking, was actually the most important influence, and British cooking should be more like French cooking. She even said there is no traditional British cuisine. And I think a lot of her influence was kind of negative for the homegrown cooking, although she was telling people to enjoy and to make foreign style food. So she introduced pizza and French cooking on television. She also introduced this kind of image conscious cooking and gas cookery. And she had a huge show at the Victoria and Albert Hall on stage, where people would come and try her recipe for French onion soup with egg and port and alcohol in the soup. And so many things about this style of cooking influenced me as I've grown up. So we're still not completely close to the answer, why is English food so meh? I've blamed the Puritans after the Civil War. I've blamed Mrs. Beeton's English cookery, and now I'm blaming Fanny Craddock a little bit as well. And this brings us to 2010 and Jamie Oliver. Jamie Oliver tried to refresh British cooking. He had a TV program called The Naked Chef. And in his program, the ingredients were supposed to be the main thing. You were supposed to not add too much to the food. After his quite successful TV show, he then moved on to try and help schools to have better food. One of his ideas was that children didn't know about food, and so he took children vegetables to look at and asked them to identify vegetables, and many of the children couldn't actually identify a vegetable. So here he's showing them tomatoes and they're going, potatoes, because they haven't seen the vegetables growing in the field and their parents haven't talked to them about raw vegetables and cooking. Jamie Oliver also said that school meals contain much, much too much fat and too much sugar. So here he is with a wheelbarrow. This is the amount of sugar which is put in school milk in 5 years. So he got very angry and threw the sugar in front of the audience in the studio. He did the same thing with French fries, looking at the number of French fries which a kid will eat in 1 year. And it was a huge amount of fast food and sugar in the food, which is being given to children. So Jamie's message was, let's make a better school lunch. And he actually got a position to improve school lunches. I've just come back to an image of Her Majesty the late Queen and kind of classic British meal to say, you know, is there something about the British diet which is lacking? And I think we can say if the Queen's eating this kind of meat and vegetables, very simple, plain, not really bad, but, you know, it's a little boring. And that's what the Queen's eating with some alcohol every day, then maybe we need to rely on other countries as our inspiration. So I'm going to end with this very joyful picture. One of the great things about the fact that British cooking is kind of patchy at best and does not have a great tradition of food in the way that Indian, Chinese, French, and Japanese food, French food, Italian food have a very solid tradition, and they kind of know this is our national cuisine. The fact that we don't really have that so strongly means that we're free to be very good at borrowing from places. So you can see around me, I've got Italian food and Chinese food and Indian food and French bread. And I think one of Britain's strengths today is that we can borrow from those. I noticed that when Japan, because I'm now resident in Japan, when Japan started to borrow from foreign food, they made a law in about 1872 that when they were going to have a banquet, a big party to impress foreign dignitaries, they would have a chef, but their foreign chef would be, do you know which country? Their foreign chef would be French. So much of the food which the Japanese think of as washoku is indeed a kind of fusion of Japanese taste and foreign taste, but most of it is not, unfortunately, British. Thank you for listening. Enjoy your fusion. Fusion is mixed cuisine.